Throughout the nuclear tensions of the 1980s, Scotland was an important geographic pivot point for the United States military operations, and the implications for its inhabitants were therefore significant. Due to its strategic location, it was in the front line of the Cold War, and by 1980 it had an American nuclear ballistic missile submarine base, intelligence gathering sites, strategic reinforcement airfields, as well as communication stations and administrative locations. There was never any lessening of the American presence, as Scotland fulfilled a strategic imperative of establishing targets for the Soviets away from mainland USA. There was a reason, however, for all this US military presence, as during the Cold War, the North Sea and the waters off the coast of Scotland held strategic importance due to their proximity to the Soviet Union and the potential for naval and maritime activities. Great importance was placed on the Greenland-Iceland-UK or GIUK gap. Ships and submarines from the USSR and the USA had to transit this gap to be in range to launch attacks. Additionally, the presence of crucial NATO naval bases made the region a focal point for both defensive and offensive strategies. Control over these waters was integral to monitoring and countering Soviet naval movements, safeguarding sea lines of communication, and maintaining a deterrent against potential aggression. It was in this context that a major incident occurred right under the waves. US weapons. The United States had a wide spectrum of military establishments in Cold War Scotland. These included airfields at Machrihanish and Prestwick, anchorages in the West Highland Sea locks, port facilities at Rosyth and Greenock, logistic bases at Glendouglas and elsewhere, a nuclear submarine base at Holy Loch, and navigation stations at the Shetlands and Thurso. They had live firing ranges at Cape Wrath, communications networks from Aberdeen to Galloway, as well as strategic intelligence gathering sites at Kirk Newton, Edzell and Thurso. These sites became more important to the USA when intelligence gathering facilities were lost in Turkey and Pakistan in the late 1960s. Holy Loch was the most important American base in the UK, and became America's first Polaris nuclear missile submarine base in 1961. This location was described as a magnet that would draw enemy missiles away from the mainland USA. It fitted the American strategic requirement to be close to the Soviet targets, but far away from the shores of the USA. It could ensure that the submarine refit program and crew turnover activities could be achieved without the need for lengthy, non-operational voyages back to the USA. It was known as Fleet Ballistic Missile Refit Site 1. Because of Holy Loch, the USA had short transit times to patrol areas near the Soviet Union. In contrast, the Soviet bases required their submarines to make a long transit through the NATO-monitored GIUK gap to their mid-ocean patrol areas. By 1980, Holy Loch was the sole USA nuclear-armed submarine base in Europe. Congested Waters. The submarines of Submarine Squadron 14, or Subron 14, conducted sea trials in the Firth of Clyde and Irish Sea before their missions, occasionally brushing with Soviet intelligence gathering trawlers in the area. As Holy Loch was now the sole USA nuclear-armed submarine base in Europe, following the closure of the other European base at Rota in Spain, it was a hotspot for Soviet spy trawlers and submarines alike, with the waters being a hive of activity for espionage and naval drills. The Soviets devoted a significant amount of effort to intelligence gathering activities in Scottish waters. This involved ferret flights and a fleet of intelligence gathering vessels, mainly trawlers, which regularly berthed at Ullapool, which was often crowded with trawlers who were covered with antenna but no fishing equipment. The Soviets maintained a large fleet of these intelligence gathering trawlers along the west and north coasts of Scotland during this period, as they needed information about NATO activity in the GIUK gap. Surveillance of each other by both parties was common, and the UK Armed Forces also occasionally took part, with submarines being tracked a fairly common occurrence, as can be seen in a case a few years prior to the incident. The Soviets routinely sent submarines to waters around Scotland, where they would attempt to detect, track and trail Royal Navy and US Navy ballistic missile carrying submarines as they deployed from the Royal Navy base at Faslane and the US Navy base at Holy Loch. A little under 2 years before the collision between an unidentified Soviet submarine and USS James Madison, another Soviet submarine, a nuclear-powered Victor-class submarine, was detected in the Clyde approach areas. For 6 days, the Soviet submarine remained 60 miles northwest of Donegal and 50 miles off Colonsay, where it was kept under 24-hour surveillance by RAF Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft, operating out of RAF Kinloss. It was eventually chased out of the area by HMS Conqueror, a Royal Navy nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarine. Just a scratch. As the incident was a top-secret affair, the details surrounding it are not all there. However, there is still a significant amount of information known about the incident. In November of 1974, the US submarine SSBN James Madison, armed with 16 Poseidon nuclear missiles, which totaled 160 warheads, collided with a Soviet vessel off the coast of Scotland. The SSBN James Madison was departing Holy Loch to take up station when it collided with a Soviet submarine waiting to take up its trail. Damage was minimal to both vessels, and the Soviet boat subsequently submerged again. In the confusion of the collision, it is perfectly feasible a war could have been sparked. The news of this incident has been covered up for 43 years. However, we now know that in the immediate aftermath of the incident, the collision left a 9-foot scratch on the side of the James Madison, and that the two submarines came within inches of sinking one another. Repercussions. All this came to light when a cable message addressed to the then US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, was declassified, having been previously marked secretized only. The cable, sent by National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, said, "Have just received word from the Pentagon that one of our Poseidon missile submarines has just collided with a Soviet submarine." The SSBN James Madison was departing Holy Loch to take up station when it collided with a Soviet submarine waiting outside the port to take up trail. Both submarines surfaced, and the Soviet boat subsequently submerged again. There is no report yet of the extent of damage. We'll keep you posted. It is unclear as to what occurred after this series of communications. However, it is presumed that the incident was swept under the rug and no further action was taken. This is also supported by another document marked Top Secret, which has also recently been released, which expressed alarm that the news of the collision had leaked. It said, "On the 3rd of January, the NID ran an item on the collision just off Holy Loch of a US Polaris submarine and a Soviet attack submarine. Unfortunately, Jack Anderson had run the same news in the Washington Post a day or two earlier. This preemption of Anderson's part forced the surfacing of a piece of information in a current intelligence 2 months after the event occurred. This deserves a Warner Wolf boo." The last sentence of the report is thought to refer to Warner Wolf, a famous TV sports broadcaster of the time. The severity of the incident could have been significantly worse, as the 1980s were a turbulent time for USA-Soviet relations. The United States boycotted the 1980s Olympics in Moscow in retaliation for the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. President Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire in 1983, and Andropov suspended USA-Soviet arms control talks. The Warsaw Pact nations, in turn, boycotted the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. President Reagan's Star Wars program and the shooting down of a South Korean airliner by Soviet fighter jets in September 1983 increased pressure to a scale unknown since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fortunately for humanity, the incident didn't amount to anything more significant, and it joined the ever-growing list of near misses for the two superpowers of the era, and for mankind. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, then please give it a like, and for more amazing tales and thrilling stories, don't forget to subscribe to Uncovered Secrets. Also, hit the bell icon to stay notified for every release.